John, your registered dietitian here. Today talking with Elijah, one of our personal trainers, about all things muscle, kind of what's best from both nutrition and exercise. So Elijah, I'll let you start with some questions.
Well, like as a trainer, I'm asked all the time, and I'm personally interested in like building muscle, but I think more and more people are realizing that it's not just an aesthetic thing to try and build muscle, and it's not just for pro athletes or football players. Like there are longevity benefits and like health benefits later in life from building muscle. And so just from like your research and your perspective, like what are some nutritional misconceptions? Because I know there are a lot of misconceptions about protein and carbs and like how people are supposed to be eating to build muscle.
Yeah, in terms of like misconceptions, I think a lot of people try to hit the 1 gram per pound number. So if you weigh 150 pounds, you need 150 grams of protein to grow and build muscle. And could you get that much? Sure. But what happens a lot of times when people try to hit such a high number for protein, they end up, especially if they're trying to do it in a healthy way, they end up missing out on the calorie containing foods they needed to in order to get there. So you'll miss out on like, things like nuts and higher quality carbs, or in some cases refined carbs.
Because they're trading those things out for a high protein.
Yeah, there's just only so much room to eat and to get full. And once you're full, you usually stop eating. And how we tell people who want to lose weight how to eat is higher protein, higher fiber. And you can still do higher fiber while you're trying to build muscle, but there's a fine line between too much and not enough. So, 1 gram a pound of protein translates to 2.2 grams per kilogram, and that's like on the high end of what you can do to build muscle. You can build generally in the 1.2 to 1.5 range, upwards of 2. But it actually becomes more important to get protein when you're losing weight because, that fullness factor we talked about, and
because you're already in a deficit.
Yeah, because you're in a deficit, your body is more prone to pull energy from muscle protein. So if you, and that's where training comes in. The best combo to lose weight and maintain muscle is resistance training. That's the physical stimulus, and the nutritional stimulus is keep your protein high. So keeping your protein high, and in those cases, upwards of 2.5, depending on how fast you're trying to lose weight.
Per kilogram?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You'd have to, multiply or divide by 2.2 to make that conversion to pounds, but it's a little different. So
you'd be looking at about like 3/4 of a gram per pound for most people. 0.7, 0.8.
I think that's how it breaks down, but
close to there.
I think your 150 pound person would be okay in the 110, 120 gram range for building relative, and that's where if you want to lose weight, 150 might keep you fuller for longer. So that's kind of the nutrition.
It's not wrong to eat more than that.
No, but
it may not be necessary.
Right, and then it becomes
Are you neglecting something else?
Exactly. Are you missing your vegetables because you had 12 ounces of chicken breast instead of the reasonable 4 to 6? Because on that front too, you pretty much build your protein per meal pretty much maximizes what you can build around the 30 to 45 gram mark, and that's where age kind of comes into play there. But
what about timing though? Like,
yeah,
is it important to do this at dinner time, at lunchtime? Bodybuilders for a long time would do 6 to 8 meals a day. Is that necessary?
Necessary, no. That's probably on the extreme side, but every time you eat is an opportunity to build muscle. You're gonna build pretty much regardless of what you eat. At rest, you're in more of a breakdown mode than you are in a build mode. So, and that's kind of where the complicated piece is that you're kind of building a little bit of muscle all the time and breaking a little bit down all the time, but it's to what degree? So when you're at rest right now, we're breaking down, unless we've eaten in the past couple hours, more than we're building. After a meal, you get a few hours to build.
So,
So
one
there's-
or two meals a day is definitely not frequent enough if you're trying to build muscle.
Correct, because so if we're working backwards, if I estimate you need 120 grams of protein a day, if you eat twice, you can get 60, and that's about it.
Mm.
And then training would, I guess, help stimulate growth, but you need enough. It's like having 12 workers and no more lumber. And you're trying to build a house. You've provided the work
Stimulus.
and you're right, but you don't have the resources to make that happen.
And you were saying about 30 per meal.
Sure.
So that's why if I only did 2 meals in a day, then I'm kind of limited to like 60 usable grams
Correct.
for building, and I probably need more like 120.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's where sometimes, as you get older, and that's why I say 30 to 45. Part of the challenge of becoming older is you need more protein to get the same effect for muscle building. It's not so much varied by training level. So if you had never trained before, it'd probably be similar, 30 to 30. And that's because your body adapts to become more efficient at using that protein. So that's kind of a wash when you control for age. But as you get older, you need about 50% more to get the same effect. So 4 ounces becomes 6 ounces. And if your appetite's worse or you're less active, or you miss more of those windows, you got to be more intentional about getting that. But
So an average size adult might be looking to do about 3 to 5, on average 3 to 5 or 6 meals with 30 grams of protein in each meal. Would be
optimally,
for an average adult.
yeah.
Okay.
Breakfast can be hard, and that's sometimes why protein shakes in the morning work for people, or eggs. Honestly, are a great quality protein.
Is there an
I'm
advantage
usually,
to any source of like plant protein versus animal protein that isn't meat versus meat?
Yeah, so
protein?
the advantage is that plant proteins are more gentle on like the kidneys. So if people have, like chronic kidney disease, then the plant proteins, for whatever reason, I think it has something to do with the deep some long drawn out explanation we don't need to talk about the shape of the protein and how that may interact with the kidneys, but yeah, so on the benefits of plant proteins, they're more kidney safe. They generally come with fiber and not just protein, so seem to also be better for like cardiac and just overall gut health. Some would argue, they might be better for the environment, at least depending on where they're sourced. But you need about 50% more plant protein to get the same muscle building response.
Oh.
So it's almost, going back to, okay, so if we need 30 in a meal to be optimal, now even at our age, we need 45. And for those people that need 45,
Okay.
now we're looking at closer to 60 or more for optimal. And that's where usually I settle for, life's not perfect. So if you can just get 20 grams a meal and you eat that as your minimum 3 times a day, usually that's enough, because you'll get other meals that might go a little bit over, or you can compensate with snacks. But
so I heard 30 grams at a sitting is kind of how much you can really use for building muscle. But if it's plant protein, we want to up that in a single sitting.
Generally.
Or you could also up the frequency of your meals, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So either's a viable option.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't gotta be optimal every time you put something in your mouth, but you want to think about protein spacing is important.
Okay.
And that's what a lot of people miss out on, I think. Protein volume, don't get me wrong, is still the most important thing. So at the end of the day, hit the amount of protein you need. And then once you get that under, you're really good at nailing that, then focus kind of on the spacing and the quality and the context of the meal, making sure you aren't, going full carnivore just to hit your protein number. You shouldn't have to do that. So,
I also have a handful of clients that are thinking they want to build muscle, but they'd like to get leaner. Let's say middle aged, for example, and they want to build some muscle but kind of get leaner, and overall fitness is their goal, longevity, health. and they're thinking about like, well, maybe I should cut carbs out and just go like keto. And they're really going high protein. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Do they still need carbs to be able to make progress?
Good question. Some people seem to do better on a lower carb diet than others. I don't know if keto seems a little strict for me. But in terms of the muscle protein effect, carbs are better than protein post-workout than protein is if you have to choose one or the other. Post-workout.
Really?
Yeah, so
Okay.
everyone I think always, post-workout, they run to their protein shakes. And historically I did too before I learned about this, but I think about it kind of like when we talk about building muscle, and to take a step back, let's just start what your body's thinking right after a training session. I just burned a bunch of energy I need to replace. And I also broken down some muscle that would be nice if I could build, but that's a secondary priority. So we have energy that we need to replace, we have muscle we need to build. It's kind of like building muscle before replacing that energy is like buying land next to your house before you paid your utility bill.
So you need to replenish the energy because your body's going to prioritize that.
Correct.
So if you just eat purely protein after a workout, your body's going to use that protein to replenish the energy rather than build muscle like you want it to.
You'll build some muscle, but the rate of that will be impaired because your body's screaming to replace the energy in the form of carbs that you just used.
So an optimal scenario would be to have carbs and protein
Correct.
post-workout, probably about 30, 40 grams of each.
Yeah, it would depend on
the person.
Yeah, I mean, even a piece of fruit, a banana, something like that. You don't need a ton, especially for we're talking about people who aren't extreme athletes.
Yeah.
So for someone like that, a banana with a little bit of protein would go further. And I've also heard if you don't get protein within an hour after your workout, you might as well just shove it somewhere.
Might as well have just sat on the couch.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
And that's just not true. You get a good few hours, and honestly, that training stimulus that enhances. So that's where you take that 30 grams of protein. Yes, even if you hadn't trained, you'll build muscle from eating protein.
Mm-hmm.
But you essentially modify that plus 50% with a good amount of training. And that makes all the difference when you start stacking those days up. And that training stimulus, you might know more about how long that lasts, but my understanding is 2 to 3 days once you've, done that. And then, you don't got to be too nitpicky about, oh, I got to run and get fast food because I can't make dinner in time. Mm-hmm. And that's where some of those...
Like I missed my 45-minute window, and now it's all ruined now.
Right.
Yeah.
So I hear some of those things too, but yeah, generally, get your 30, 45 grams of protein after the meal, but yeah, I mean, carbs are more important. So I would say take it how you feel in terms of, if you don't respond well to carbs, or a lot of people do have issues with gluten and some of the sources of carbs. So sometimes it's not the carb itself, it's the vehicle it came in, or sometimes people will just have carbs, and if you're on the diabetic spectrum or pre-diabetic, then we know that having protein with that can, prevent the blood sugar spikes.
Yeah.
So, a lot of that kind of works together. But I'm curious to hear from you in terms of, the training side of things with building muscle. Like the big questions I would think a lot of people have is like, how much should I be training? How often? Do I need? How much time do I need between sets, or how close should I go to failure? Any like?
Yeah, those are like
those
super
things?
common questions, and that I feel like has been debated for as long as people have been working out. But so I'll describe optimal, kind of like you were describing. Like you could get 20 grams, and most people 20 grams 3 times a day, like you're okay. But optimal would be this. So like for most people, optimal to build muscle is going to be probably 3 to 6 training sessions in a week. And those training sessions are not obviously not just going to be cardio or not just going to be biking. You do build some muscle when you're doing cardio, but those aren't going to be a sufficient stimulus if you're trying to actually build muscle optimally and safely. Additionally, when you're doing sets for any given exercise, generally speaking, for optimal and for most individuals, you want to be in the like 2 to 5 sets per exercise range. And that depends a little bit like on how close you go to failure, of course, right? But generally, most of the literature shows that you don't have to go all the way to or past failure on every single set. Generally, I think most people probably err on the side of not going close enough to failure. So I think that the general rule of thumb is to go about 80-90%, where you leave like reps in reserve is a common term, or reps in the tank, where you might leave 2 or 3 reps in the tank. You could have done 2 or 3 more, maybe 4 or 5, but you were pushing it. You were really feeling the burn, and you would have almost had to start sacrificing form. So you're going close to failure, and at that point, the stimulus that you get from going close to failure and going all the way to failure, and failure, by the way, is when you can't do another rep, there's a very small difference. Like the law of diminishing returns starts to come into play. So you don't need to go all the way past failure. It can be fun to do sometimes, and it creates a great stimulus, but it's a little bit overkill to do that all the time. You're going to get so fatigued, you're not going to be able to come back and have the frequency of workouts that you should have.
Gotcha.
So rest between sets, man, they're like, everybody in the gym has like a different opinion on this, but generally, the literature would suggest that if you're trying to lose weight while you're building muscle, you might want to keep them a little shorter. So in the like 30 to 90 seconds range, generally speaking, I would say the best average and the rule of thumb I use for myself and most of my clients is about 2 minutes.
Gotcha.
And sometimes it's longer. So like if we're going in between sets on a given exercise and we don't need a lot of time to change the weights and stuff, we might keep it a little shorter, like 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll make those longer rests. Strategically, we'll just use the time between like, all right, now we got to go set up another machine. Well, let's use this as our 4-minute rest time. So we'll have a few that are in the 1 to 2, and then a few that might be in the 2 to 4 range. If you're really trying to maximize your lifting and you are trying to go close to failure on any given set, then you might want more like the 3 to 6 minute. But the rule of thumb for the vast majority is about 2 minutes. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know nutritionally there, and that's where sometimes carbs makes a difference. So if you're training cardio, your body's primarily going to be using carbs if you're really well trained.
Mm-hmm.
And same with, honestly, lifting too. But because lifting isn't quite the steady state exercise that the cardio is, sometimes you can get away more with a lower carb diet. But and there are certain training adaptations that working on a low carb diet causes, but generally they're not beneficial. So to that point, like, we used to think that low intensity training worked better for endurance because if you look at the whole crossover concept, you see that intense exercise uses more carbs, things like basketball and football. And then you got like running or slower, like what we're doing now, we're primarily burning fat. So you're like, oh, well, let's just throw fat and ketogenic aids, at the problem to enhance, fat metabolism. And what we saw is those people are so well trained that even during a marathon, you prefer to use carbs for energy, to oxidize carbs and burn those. So when you go too far into the high-fat, low-carb world, you impair your ability to convert those carbohydrates as efficiently, and then on average people have performance impairments. And there are some outliers that appear to do better with some of those ketogenic aids or a low-carb diet, but
that's probably where meeting with you one-on-one is helpful, because everybody's like slightly different, and they're gonna have slightly different sensitivities and so meeting with you one-on-one is that you can learn from having a conversation or listening to a podcast, but like actually meeting with you one-on-one, you can dive into the nitty-gritty details of like that individual.
You always have to consider our guidelines are catered towards the middle of the bell curve, and that's just for any medicine, what but same as you probably know that when you work with someone long enough, you start to figure out, you're a little different in this area. Maybe you need a little more or less training volume, or you kind of have to mold it to the person and in the future. And we do have a genetic testing available to do you look like the type of person that would work well with a low carb diet, or do you respond better to this type of exercise? That kind of stuff's coming out now and is considered experimental, but I think as we get better at personalized medicine, we'll quit treating everyone as the number or the average, and we can start to look more at them as the individual they are and how their genes predict things like risk of breast cancer, and some of that's starting to come out, but probably slower than it should be. But,
well, that actually just made me think. You mentioned training volume, and I just wanted to touch on this quickly. So training volume speaks to like how much you actually do of a given workout. So your intensity is how hard you're performing that. Your duration is how long, and volume kind of falls along the lines of duration, but you could have a really long workout and not actually do a lot in it. So volume is more like how much work you're actually performing. Generally speaking, we're talking about sets that are close to failure. They're hard sets, but not all the way to failure where you're just annihilated and puking and throwing up and exhausted. Those kinds of sets for any given muscle are usually optimal in about the 20 sets per week range. And you can break that up. So that could be for your biceps. You could do 5 on Monday, 5 on Wednesday, 5 on Friday, and then maybe 5 on Saturday, for example, or 5 on Sunday. And you could also do them all at once. But generally speaking, the research shows that about 20 sets is optimal. You could do 5 and still be building muscle, especially for the average person. But 20 to 25 would probably be optimal if you really want to look at what would be the best case scenario. And then breaking them up a little bit, kind of like you were mentioning with protein, also tends to be a little bit more effective. So instead of doing them all in one day, maybe splitting it up over two days, so that way you're hitting for example, your biceps or your quads twice in a week as opposed to just once in a week, increases like the frequency of that signal. So you don't need to split it up like crazy and do 2 sets every single day. But having it set up where you can hit those 20 sets, but you might do 10 on one day and 10 on another, about 2 to 3 times a week is probably the optimal split for that.
That makes sense. And that kind of seems to gel with my understanding of, if you get that boost in protein growth for 2 or 3 days, and maybe you want to grow your biceps all week or whatever muscle group you have.
Right. That stimulus really only lasts probably 48 to 72 hours.
Right. But that allows you to get more out of your protein, effectively 50% more of the time. But wondering about your thoughts on recovery as it relates, the fitness side of things, stretching and saunas, and what do you kind of guide people towards there, and how much to what degree would we expect people to feel like stretching versus sauna or anything in that area? Do you get like 10-20% out of that? What would you
percentages? That's a good question.
Even just like what do people report to you about how they feel after stretching or sauna or that kind of stuff? Like how dramatic would you say that is?
So from a muscle building side of things, because that's kind of where we started, like there's some pretty interesting research about associating not just weightlifting but stretching with athletes who are trying to build muscle, and even stretching the muscle that we're working in between sets. So there was some research suggesting that could be helpful. It's probably not detrimental unless you're trying to go really heavy and do like a 1 rep max. Then doing a really long stretch on your chest right before you do a 1 rep max on bench press is probably not going to be helpful because it's going to be excessively stretched. But some mild stretching in between sets when you're not trying to hit a max or a PR is probably actually beneficial to giving a higher stimulus for muscle growth. Additionally, when you do those repetitions, you want to make sure you prioritize. So we talk a lot about range of motion, but in the range of motion, you want to prioritize the stretched. So if I'm doing like a dumbbell press, right, and I'm lowering the dumbbell down, the stretched portion, now my pec muscle is stretched out. That's the most important part of that range of motion. So I'll see sometimes people do half reps, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Like, let's say you're doing a bicep curl and you're doing from this part to here, so from 90 degrees all the way up, and that's the half rep you're doing. That's like the least productive part of the rep. The most productive part, probably by like 2/3 or 3/4, is going all the way down to the bottom, and when you get up to 90 degrees, so that's where the bicep is actually stretched. So trying to make sure you're getting the muscle stretched when you're working it is pretty significantly important. And having a tempo where it's slow enough that you actually can feel that stretch. So you're lowering slowly and controlling the weight, and now I'm like, wow, that muscle's really stretched out, and then we're going for another rep.
Gotcha.
As opposed to just trying to pound them out. And then from a recovery standpoint, I think stretching is super important, especially just for injury prevention. Like when the hamstrings are tight and some of the other muscles around the knee, like the popliteus is a little muscle under your calf, if those muscles are weak or they're tight, those will often lead to knee pain for people later in life. So sometimes, I mean, if you can get ahead of it and have a good recovery routine that involves stretching and like using the power plates and saunas and things like that, you could potentially save yourself from bone-on-bone knees down the road, and
Gotcha.
you know, discs that are bulging in your spine, and all of those types of things, just because weightlifting is very important, but it creates a lot of stress, and so making sure that things stay loose,
Yeah.
I think is pretty important from a longevity standpoint as well.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because I think a lot of times it's, you know, I was asking, I think more in the acute, you know, short term kind of stuff, but in the long term, if you're able to stay healthy enough to just stick with it, there's probably enough benefit with just the nutrition training piece alone that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, barring some kind of setback, injury, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably where, you know, you fall less, you live longer,
Right.
keep your muscle mass, bone mass all kind of stay high. So
And one day of nutrition counseling or training, and by the way, I try to always include a mini stretching and recovery session in the training sessions, but like one day doesn't make really any visible difference, but doing it repeatedly over time, you know, months, years, can make all the difference.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you.